All right, I think that we can get started now. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's panel entitled Living Intersectionality in Academia, Emerging Scholars. My name is Emily Cooch, and I am the Program Consultant for Eurasia at PEN America. PEN America is an advocacy organization that stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect free expression in the United States and worldwide. Today's session features emerging scholars who inhabit marginalized identity positions, including scholars with non-normative genders and sexualities, racial and ethnic minorities, and immigrants and international students. Today, we will be discussing the ways in which marginalized identities fundamentally shape the academic experience and explore how othering works within universities as well as the field more broadly. This session is part of the series Intersectionality and Focus, from critical pedagogies to research practice and public engagement in Slavic, East European, and Eurasian studies. We'd like to start off by thanking the sponsors for this series, including the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, the University of Pittsburgh Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, as well as peer centers from across the country. You can see a full list of these on the registration page for this discussion. So before I go into introductions, I'll just say a few words about the format of today's session. The first 45 minutes to an hour will be a structured discussion with the panelists, and the final 15 minutes to half an hour will be questions and thoughts and comments from the audience. Just so you are aware, the Q&A function on Zoom will be open throughout the session, but I'll be reading out your questions to the panelists in that final half hour to 15 minutes. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our very accomplished group of panelists for today. So we are joined today, firstly, by Kellen Baker. Kellen is the Executive Director of the Whitman Walker Institute, which is the research policy and education arm of the Whitman Walker Clinic in Washington, D.C. He was a Russian major and spent several years in Moscow working as a translator before beginning his career in health policy. Our second panelist is Nadja Greku. Nadja is an MA candidate in international relations at the Central European University in Vienna, Austria. Her research focuses broadly on the governmentality and securitization and insecuritization of Roma. Our third panelist today is Christy Monet. Christy is a Ph.D. candidate pursuing a joint degree in political science and Slavic languages and literatures at the University of Chicago. And finally, our fourth panelist is Raushan Zhandayeva. Raushan is a second-year political science Ph.D. student at George Washington University, where she focuses on post-Soviet Eurasia and specifically Central Asia. So I think to get today's session started, the first question worth discussing here really is a perhaps deceptively simple one. And that question is, how do you define intersectionality and why is the term important to you? So I think this is an opportunity for the panelists to tell us about what led them to this point in their careers and why this issue is important to them. So I think we can start with Kellen, then we'll go to Nadja, Christy, and Raushan, if that sounds good. So Kellen, what does intersectionality mean to you and why is it important to you personally?
Sure. Thank you, Emily, for the question. I come from a legal and policy background, so for me, it's important to trace where this concept came from, particularly given that now it's become such a topic that elicits, I would say, sort of almost controversial or knee-jerk reactions in the incredibly polarized space that is US politics and media right now. If you go back to what intersectionality originally meant, it is the simple recognition that people experience discrimination, oppression, and mistreatment differently depending on their overlapping identities. So you can't understand the experiences, for example, that someone is having as a woman without also thinking about the ways in which race or sexual orientation or disability status factor in. And I should say a related topic that I like is kyriarchy, which is something we don't hear very often, but it's related to the source of the word patriarchy. So thinking about the ways in which society is structured in the case of patriarchy to benefit men, kyriarchy actually tries to look at the ways in which all of the different types of oppressions, social forces that people experience are intersectional and related to each other, so that it's really, again, impossible to look at the experiences that somebody is having along one axis of their identity without understanding how other aspects of who they are factor in. And it's an important concept for me, both intersectionality and kyriarchy, because it is often so easy to get sort of pigeonholed or siloed into just working on one particular issue, sort of thinking about what does it mean to experience sexism, or what does it mean to experience racism? What does it mean to experience homophobia or transphobia? And it's really important to think about each one of those types of social oppressions because they are unique, but they all also happen together. And when they intersect with each other, it's not just additive, it's multiplicative, it's exponential. And so figuring out how these things interact with each other is really critical to making sure that we're developing solutions, doing research, doing good policy that actually tries to unravel not just one aspect of the oppression and discrimination that people are encountering, but that full sort of Gordian knot of how all of these forces intersect with each other.
Great, that's a really good point. I think that the idea of hierarchy, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is important to bring up, because I think that when we talk about intersectionality, so often we're only focusing on the people who are subject to the oppression and not so much where the sources of that oppression. So I think that's a really valuable point to make here. So I think now we'll move on to Nadja. So Nadja, what's your definition of intersectionality and why is the term important to you personally?
Thank you, Emily, and also thank you to Zhandayeva and everyone else who made this possible. For me, I mean, firstly, I've been introduced to intersectionality in terms of it being an analytical tool, and it's something that I use while producing knowledge. But even without it being viewed as an analytical tool, I mean, intersectionality, it is just, without researchers, without academia, it is the lived experience that we have and that we create daily. It is important because it helps us understand the world in terms of pluriversity and multi-logics. And in that way, we are more honestly approaching another human being and ourselves. And it's a way to gain wholesome knowledge. But also it is a way to make our struggle towards dignity much easier and more meaningful. So I do use it as a tool to gain acknowledgement for myself, but I also use it as a tool when I'm trying to understand on the daily basis, not solely through my work, on the daily basis, to understand another human being. And I think that that's the value of it. And I keep, finding value as there are multi-layers of it as a tool.
That's great. That's really interesting. So when you say that you use it as an analytical tool, do you mean that in the context of your academic work, or in the context of how you, as a woman who's part of the Roma community, interact with the academic world and the world more broadly?
As I said, I've been introduced to it as an analytical tool in terms of studying international relations. But as that became part of my work, I also started to understand it being part of the daily analytics that we do in encounters with others. So the way that I understand myself and others on the daily basis, intersectionality actually helps me that those daily encounters are more honest, more productive, more wholesome, more meaningful. And in that sense, I think it's really important to know that it is not only about what's happening in academia. And at the end of the day, academia itself is about human encounters. So, yeah.
Sure, that's great. So let's move on to Christy now. Christy, how would you define intersectionality and why has the term been important to you personally?
Yeah, I mean, basically, Kellen and Nadja already said a bunch of the things that are also sort of overlap with my ideas about intersectionality. But I mean, I would say it is both this really important and salient framework, but also just kind of a fact of social life in a way that, you can't understand human diversity, like the human diversity or diversity of human experience, without really engaging with the layers of identity that sort of makes up everyone's interface with the rest of the social world. For me, I guess even before I knew there was a word that people were using sort of in institutions as a framework, as a really important framework, it really did seem to be, once I understood what people meant when they were talking about intersectionality, it really just seemed to be a perfect reflection of the way that I had been moving through the world and had been, both sort of struggling with and curious about and committed to understanding other people and all of their, like all the facets of their identity, and how that played into how they saw themselves, how that played into how others saw them, what was expected of them, all of these, the challenges they faced, and for some, the advantages that they gain that others don't have access to. So, I mean, yeah, I certainly like what Nadja said about sort of using this as a tool that really helps our struggle towards dignity. I like that. For me, I've always seen it as a sort of a tool to help us minimize oppression in our social worlds. So that's why it's important to me.
Great. So I like that phrase that you use, minimize the oppression in our social worlds. So a question that I'm interested in relation to that, which we'll get to after Raushan gives her definition, is how do we stop intersectionality from just becoming one of those empty buzzwords that people tend to like to use, like decolonization? It gets thrown around a lot, but it seems like not a lot of people are very clear on what it actually means. And I feel like we're in the same danger when we talk about intersectionality. But we'll get to that after Raushan tells us what she understands by the term intersectionality and why that's important to her. Raushan?
Thank you, Emily. I would just like to echo, I guess, what everyone else said already, but I guess at the end of the day, for me, intersectionality is simply a recognition of different experiences and different ways of learning and knowing things, and sort of bringing out and acknowledging unique experiences, especially those that we often don't hear and those that are not like in the mainstream, that are often left on the margins, and sort of recognizing them and putting them like at the center of our attention. And for me, I guess, as a local scholar from Central Asia, in a Western institution, it's being important for me just to understand and assess my positionality in the field, but also beyond, and also sort of understand myself and what parts of my identity empower me and what parts of my identity sort of makes me less privileged in comparison to others. So for example, if I talk about academia as a field, and we need to acknowledge that it's gives us a pretty high status in society, and we are privileged to study and explore what we want to. But at the same time, when I started assessing my positionality within the field or within the academia, I understand that my intersectional identities, and like especially as a woman of color, especially a woman from Central Asia, the academia as a field has not been built by women like me, or by women like by people like me, or by people for me. So like that's just important in understanding myself even.
Sure. So if you don't mind me going back to this question of, how can we ensure that the term intersectionality continues to have real meaning and impact on the lives of scholars in this field? Raushan, how do you think that we can stop this from just becoming a buzzword, something that, sounds nice in the title of panels, but that isn't actually implemented in practice?
Well, first of all, it's important to recognize that the work of the scholars with marginalized identities exist. Unfortunately, often people, claim that the work is absent, but it exists. If you just, go to Twitter, and you will see so many amazing people with amazing research and amazing work that unfortunately doesn't get featured. What we see is that work missing from sort of our classrooms and our syllabi that instructors construct. And while it's important to sort of, even in my training, to understand sort of the canonical works, of earlier scholarship, I think it's also important for future scholars to sort of and to understand and reflect the contemporary field that of research with like all of its diverse perspectives and authorships. I guess what we as scholars can do in that, like in a field where name recognition and citations matters a lot, we need to support each other's works. We need to share it with our network. We need to include it in our syllabi. Unfortunately, what I see also among people with marginalized identities is this like sort of constructed sense of shortage and constructed like sense that we all need to compete for some resources. And I think that's like disempowering in a sense, because I think we all need to support each other.
It's great, excellent point. Kellen, could we go back to you on this question? You gave a really good definition of intersectionality at the start, as well as its antithesis. So how do you think that we can ensure this term continues to have real meaning and impact within academia?
I really appreciated what Raushan said just now about this sort of constructed narrative of scarcity, that there can be only one, that there's only so much bandwidth, funding, space, attention, utility of a work that looks specifically at the experiences of people who come from different backgrounds or have different intersecting, overlapping identities. And so I think looking for opportunities to support each other, and also to look for opportunities to be real about who we are. It's not lost on me the irony that I was the one who was invited to define intersectionality first, looking like this, as a white man, and also I'm transgender, and also I'm queer. So I transitioned in Russia. I came out as queer in the United States and have experiences of being queer and trans in different countries of the world. And so that does intersect with who I am and the kind of privilege that I wear, with being this identity that people clearly see, but then also having those other aspects of my identity that people maybe don't see immediately. And so I think it's really critical for us to work on creating safe spaces for each other, to do what we can to create safe spaces for ourselves, so that we can bring our whole selves, bring our whole backgrounds and all of these different perspectives to bear on our work. And a really critical component of safe spaces for each other and ourselves is within the academy, within academia. This idea that research that looks at things that we care a lot about, that we are tied to personally, is somehow less legitimate in terms of scholarship. There's so much out there, where white men, cisgender straight white men, go and study the other, and that's considered objective scholarship. But when we look at our communities and who we are, that's considered, oh, well, maybe that's a little bit subjective, isn't it? It's a little bit me search, right? The idea that you're sort of navel gazing rather than contributing to scholarship. And that is such a damaging idea, and it really needs to be banished. And scholars who come from all of our different backgrounds with all of these different overlapping identities need to be actively supported in creating what we know to be the only type of scholarship that's really meaningful, which is where it's really grounded in understanding the perspectives of the communities that we come from and the communities that we're doing our work in.
It's a really valuable point. Nadja, do you want to jump in on this idea of how we can make intersectionality continue to have real meaning and impact in academia?
Yeah, I mean, Raushan and Kellen had some really beautiful, heartfelt things to say. It is about creating. So if we don't create, if we only preach and we do not live it, we do not mindfully work on creating communities of care, communities of empathy, then we are not really using intersectionality in our daily lives. I think that also, as Raushan said, we really need to be mindful that at a certain point, although we are marginalized, we are gaining certain positions of power. I mean, I'm talking personally from a personal perspective. I do have a certain position of power, although I am coming from a marginalized community. In that sense, I have the duty not to be a gatekeeper. I have the duty to invite others and not to view this as a competition, but as a possibility to create a more caring caring world. So we start with ourselves and with the communities that we create, and then the rest can build up. But it is a struggle. It is, I mean, we daily, for example, the academia is certainly a vicious place, and it kind of navigates you towards becoming a gatekeeper. So it's very important to mindfully say, okay, now I need to open the space for someone else and share this and learn from another.
That's a really beautiful point. Thank you. Christy, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I really loved what Nadja said about, I mean, this was, as soon as you asked the question, the first thing that popped up into my mind is sort of live it, you know, to not let this just be sort of a buzzword or a motto or anything like that, but to really live it in the way that we both just on a daily level approach others, but also professionally, to not let this, you know, perception of scarcity or this perceived sort of the perceived lack of this work scare us from bringing in our own, centering our own lived experiences, our own identities, letting that guide us as we craft syllabi or as we sort of think about creating conferences, you know, not being afraid, oh, this is a conference on, you know, post-Soviet Russian-US relations, not being afraid to bring in issues like shared or different experiences of marginalized communities like LGBTQ plus and racialized communities, ethnic communities, you know, not being afraid to break that mold, even though we might not see those kinds of lines of research centered, you know, in academia and journals, just, you know, not, I mean, I guess not being afraid to be path breakers in that sense, you know. So I think that's living it that way, sort of living it fearlessly is the best way to keep it from becoming just, you know, a buzzword.
I really like that phrase, living it fearlessly. I feel like that needs to that needs to be all of our motto going forward. So moving now from the definition and practice of intersectionality towards the definition of the field that we're actually all now talking about, which is this very kind of almost ungainly space called, you know, Slavic, Eurasian, East European studies. So as we all know, this encompasses such a large and diverse geographic area. We have the countries of the former Soviet Union, we have the Balkans, we have, of course, the Caucasus. So often the scholars and professionals who work on these areas are very siloed and don't necessarily talk to each other. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how we can break down these silos and create a meaningful dialogue about intersectionality without erasing the very different socio-cultural and political context that exists within this very large region called CESE. Raushan, can we go to you first on that one?
Thank you. I guess I'll start with like post-Soviet countries, since that's where I more or less know, like the field I know about. I think what we see nowadays is that field is sort of tends to be lumped in together, failing, as you mentioned, obviously to recognize different social, cultural, political aspects on the ground. We see how like Soviet legacy is used to produce papers, to how we see multiple times like phenomenon X there, like is a Soviet legacy. And obviously, like arguably, a lot of the political institutions that function nowadays there were a product of Soviet politics. But it's also important to recognize that like the actual experiences on the like in the local context, and also this approach has, you know, obvious methodological problems. Those countries existed before the Soviet Union, and obviously had a large, like huge spans of history. So where do we draw a line of what legacies matters and what don't? So it's necessary for scholars to recognize those diverse experiences in the field. At the same time, it's important for the scholars to maintain dialogue and recognize common patterns across the context. And I understand sort of why we see similar different results from a comparative perspective. And the second point that I want to add is sort of on the sort of dominance in the field of those that study Russia, because at the end of the day, a lot of sort of when you study Russia and apply the knowledge that you gain to Russia to other countries, it sort of can result in definitely like biased results. When it comes to Central Asia specifically, many scholars, especially in Western academia, justify studying Central Asia because of its like geopolitical importance for the United States. We have Russia there, we have China there, and therefore it's important to study Central Asia. Well, it's important to study Central Asia on its own. It's important to study the experiences of people on the ground and how things play out there, instead of just assuming that like people and the countries in Central Asia are sort of just like those like geopolitical pawns. Thank you. I'll end here.
I think that's a really important point, especially now with what's been happening in Kazakhstan during this past month. We've seen a lot of the West analysis using this, rather infamous phrase now, Putin's backyard, to refer to the Central Asian countries, which is in and of itself an extremely problematic phrase. So I think if we move now to Nadja, since you can speak from a more Southeast Europe perspective, so I'll reiterate some of the question as a reminder. So how do you think we can break down the silos between the kind of sub-regions within this big region called CIS, and how can we ensure that there's meaningful dialogue about intersectionality between them without erasing the differences?
I mean, it is quite a challenging question, especially when you're working on it. And you can easily fall into the trap of essentializing a region, or doing your writing in such a way that it talks about exceptionalism. At the same time, this comes as a burden because academia always works in terms of investment. So you can invest certain time for a particular topic, which covers a particular region, and you're constrained in that sense. So your attention goes to drawing very capitalistically, drawing as much as you can with as little investment as you can make, because you also need a lot of time to go through the genealogy of a certain region. And that can be a trap, and it's really hard to get out of it. For me, I think the most important thing is to be mindful that when we view a region, for example, especially when scholars from US or from Western Europe write about Southeast Europe or regions of Southeast Europe, they really need to be mindful, and myself also, of how we can potentially create power asymmetries between these regions. And even with having a completely different intention, having a good intention, we can very easily fall into the trap of creating these power asymmetries by essentializing certain regions. Maybe what we could do is acknowledge in our writing process that there might be unintended consequences, and also make sure that we not only learn about a region from our own ivory towers, but then look deeply into the genealogy of the region, consult colleagues from that region, ask, not be ashamed to ask, because very often, I mean, scholars, including myself, we are ashamed to ask, and we think that we can do everything from our libraries. And our libraries are great, they are a great tool, but then meeting another scholar from that region can significantly help us.
I think that's a good point. And what you were saying about power asymmetries, I think that's something that we have to bear in mind, not just in academia, but when we're talking about foreign policy and the NGO sector as well. So myself coming from, the human rights advocacy sector, and prior to that, the grant making sector, however good the intentions are on the side of those American or Western European institutions, what can very often happen is that there's an inequality between, the organization that's giving the grant money and the one that's receiving it. And I think that we see this kind of unequal relationship replicated in academia, in policy, and in other sectors as well. So I think let's go now to Christy. What do you think about, CEAS as this very large, ungainly region, and how can we ensure that intersectionality has meaning when we're talking about the very different contexts within it?
I mean, that's a great question. And similar to the way that Kellen started talking about intersectionality by talking about, sort of a genealogy, or like, what are the origins sort of this word and its meanings? Like, it's interesting to me in terms of whatever we choose to call it. I mean, the long acronyms, or, post-Soviet, Slavic, which doesn't include all of the post-Soviets. There's so many different ways we could talk about it. But it's a difficult question, because I think part of the entire field does come from something that Raushan talked about, the sort of Cold War moment, and how, what was useful to certain countries at the time in terms of how to study regions, what was useful to ideas of sort of national security, national interest, all of these things. So I think trying to break away, in this instance, trying to break away or branch out into different directions from that origin point, trying to sort of move away from it as we've moved away from that historical moment, in theory and in practice. In theory, I think studying all the different societies or countries, communities in these regions, if we can get away from sort of universalizing types of theories, from sort of taking them for granted that, this is this space with these boundaries, and it has this specific type of history that we know of because all of these scholars from this area have set that down as such, and we can only work in those parameters. Getting away from that, challenging that would be great. Having a theory that sort of centers instead exactly this thing that intersectionality tries to get at, which is the diversity of human experience, seeing these areas not as post-Soviet explicitly, or like most importantly, or Slavic speaking, or any of these things, but just seeing them as areas where humans live with histories and experiences, and kind of backing up in that way would be good in theory. And I think in practice, exactly what has been said already. Not practicing research alone, not reproducing the siloing of knowledge by sitting alone in our libraries, or sitting alone in our studies, or publishing alone even, not being afraid to co-publish, not being afraid to co-sponsor events and conferences, to really spread around and create that community that I think intersectionality is interested in as a framework in promoting. So I think those could be good ways to get away from sort of reproducing the same types of knowledge about these areas. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think as well that interdisciplinarity is important when we're talking about these issues. So not just looking at this region from a political science perspective, or, a sociology perspective, which, regrettably often happens. But I think that, bringing in the collaboration with, scholars, or even people outside of the academy who aren't producing, work in the traditional, canonical style is really important for valorizing these experiences. So I think we'll go now to Kellen. What do you think about this large term called CEAS, and how can we ensure that conversations about intersectionality are meaningful within it?
Having been one of those Russian majors who was completely shocked when I went to countries like Mongolia and expected that Russian would be much more of a lingua franca there than it was, this is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, this sort of degree to which we come in with our biases. Me in particular, again, as somebody who looks like this and has the experience of studying Russia among all of these different countries, thinking about how to break down that monolithic perspective. And some of the things that I think about, there's so many important points that have already been raised, looking at, for example, the degree to which we're using frameworks that are useful for this external perspective, such as the US national security perspective, to define a region, instead of looking at other commonalities that might arise from the region itself. So, for example, the experience of empire, the experience of being colonized, which is not unique to Central Asia, is not unique to the Caucasus. There are so many ways in which the experiences of, for example, countries in the global South relate to these experiences of countries that are lumped together in this sort of post-Soviet space, and sort of looking for opportunities to draw out threads like that, instead of, again, enforcing these or putting these frameworks that come from this sort of narrow Cold War mindset of what America's interests were in understanding, or Western Europe's interests were in understanding what these countries were and what was happening there. And I think another thing that comes to mind, again, it's already been discussed, but I think a lot in terms of the language that we're using, these reductive descriptions for the region, the former Soviet Union, unless we're really talking specifically about something that really does relate to what the Soviet Union was doing in a particular moment in time, we need to be breaking down that enormous essentially meaningless term to talk about what we really mean. So we see this all the time in LGBT, for example, right? People, they're talking about gay issues, but they say LGBT without recognizing the ways that that invisibilizes everyone else who is a part of that LGBT umbrella, right? Being gay is different from being lesbian. It's different from being bisexual, and it's very different from being transgender. And so similarly, with regard to phrases like people of color, if you're talking about Black people, say Black people, because otherwise using these big reductive terms just serves to erase the people involved, it serves to erase the cultures involved, and it narrows our scholarship. I mean, if we look, for example, at LGBT issues in the region, there's a very sort of common concept that LGBT issues are simply taboo in quote unquote the former Soviet Union, because everyone sees Russia, for example, putting into place these laws that are expressly targeting the open expression of quote unquote homosexuality. But actually, there's a very long tradition, or a very long history at this point in various countries in the region. Kyrgyzstan comes to mind as an excellent example of a place where there are nonprofits that have been doing incredible work around lesbian, gay, transgender issues in particular, but get no recognition because the narrative is that, oh, well, the former Soviet Union is homophobic. We are missing so much in terms of, again, the experiences of people on the ground, but also the opportunity to do real scholarship that really sees incredible advances in a lot of these different areas where we might not, where we need more examples of ways that work can be done, ways that lives can be lived outside of this sort of hegemonic Western Europe, US centric perspective. And there are so many things that we simply blind ourselves to when we use this really broad strokes reductionist language.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. I think the issue of, terms like, LGBTQ plus and people of color is a really interesting one, because I think, as you say, on the one hand, it does erase the very substantial differences and experiences that exist between the groups within those umbrellas. But at the same time, I think that there are moments when phrases like people of color, like LGBTQ plus, can offer a means of creating solidarity between individuals, and that's something that I've very much found navigating through this field up until this point. So I hope you don't mind me going a little bit off script here, but Kellen, you've mentioned a couple times your experiences in Russia and in countries in the region. And Christy, I think that we've discussed before your experiences in Russia as well. I'd be really interested to hear from both of you how you found those experiences in those countries, how they differed, and what it meant for you to kind of be in those spaces. Kellen, in your case as a trans man who's also queer, and Christy, in your case as a Black woman. So Christy, we can go to you first on that one. I'd be interested to hear your experiences.
Well, yeah, I spent a lot of time, I guess maybe since 2009, I've spent a lot of time back and forth in Russia, and particularly in the far east of Russia, Primorsky Krai, the city of Vladivostok. And it is, I think not studying in Moscow or St. Petersburg was one of the best decisions I ever made, both for my own sort of my own, sort of, I guess, for my own identity and my own intersectionality, as it played a role in my studying this region, because I quickly saw sort of differences, interesting differences in terms of how people reacted to me, and how I was able to move about in the Russian Far East, as opposed to later when I would spend summers in Moscow or St. Petersburg. It is a very different feeling. And I guess if I just say it like bluntly, I mean, I found folks in the Russian Far East to have just been more welcoming to me and more open and genuine with me about any number of things. And I found conversations just with complete strangers on the street. I mean, it was shocking. I came in with my own expectations of how I might be treated in Russia. And anytime I would step outside in Vladivostok, I'd just be like, oh my God, I hope like XYZ doesn't happen. And anytime anyone approached me, I was always ready to be offended, or to be I needed to be on guard a little, not only as just a foreign woman, but also as a Black foreign woman. But even that differential between how I experienced my time in the Far East versus Central Russia, Moscow or St. Petersburg, also opened me up to the different layers of identities of people in Russia itself. I guess coming from the United States, studying Russia in the United States, before going there, it just seemed like this is this large country and it has like a pretty homogenous population. Like, I mean, it's not really it's not the focus of any class on Russia when I was an undergrad was not really about the diversity or a sort of the population as diverse. So when I went there, I mean, it's just it's sort of hard to put into words the experience, I guess. I think studying in different parts of Russia helped me see different layers of identity for Russian-speaking folks who are not primarily Russian speakers as their native language, who are Russian, live in Russia, and all of those things. But it has been, despite my seeing that, it still has been difficult communicating to Russian friends issues of intersectionality and identity. I've known these friends, many of them since 2009, and I know their families, I know their spouses, their children. I know they've shared with me like struggles of their background, and yet still, I mean, maybe just because of this is how media works globally, if I bring up anything about Black Lives Matter, or even if I didn't bring it up, even if someone there brought it up to me, it turns into a really uncomfortable conversation, but one that I'm willing to have, because I think we're not going to get anywhere without having those uncomfortable conversations. And I think I had discussed before that, when I was there in October, I was in St. Petersburg in October, and friends from the Russian Far East had moved to St. Petersburg, and they had asked me about like what's happening in America since Trump was like lost the election. Do people stop protesting and like ruining the country? And it became this really awkward conversation where I tried, to meet them where they were, and to as people who've known each other for a long time, as friends, to go into that and say, well, you really have to understand like these long historical processes. This is something that's been going on for 2 years. And that turned into a conversation whereby one of my friends' acquaintances used my bringing up about teaching history honestly to talk about, oh, I understand that completely. I wish that Russian history taught the Soviet period more honestly, and that we could like praise Stalin more. for what he contributed. And it just, those kinds of conversations it's so difficult. And I guess I'm proud that, we had this conversation. It was about 2 hours long. We just went through this conversation, and it was mostly in Russian, but it was very uncomfortable. But I also felt like the next time they bring that up, they will be prepared to have, I guess they thought they would just make a kind of joke and that we wouldn't get into it. But I guess, facing it like, well, no, you brought it up and this is real and we have to talk about it. So, facing those uncomfortable conversations as a person from a marginalized community, of course, that burden usually falls on you, but that is one of the burdens of a person from a marginalized population that I am more than willing to take on, because I don't think many other people in those sort of issue areas would be able to meet that challenge as well as someone from that population could. So yeah, it's just,
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there's two interesting strands that you brought up there. Firstly, I can certainly relate to, having different experiences in different parts of Russia. I'm one of those people who did study in Moscow, but, I managed to travel outside that a lot. And, my experience as an Asian woman in Moscow versus my experience as an Asian woman in Buryatia, completely different. Because in Buryatia, I was boring because I just looked like half of the other people out there, but that was not the case in Moscow. So yeah, I can definitely see that. And I think that your point about, having those uncomfortable conversations, with Russian people when you're there, it made me think of, when I saw the title of this panel, Uncomfortable Conversations, how, people who do inhabit marginalized identities, we often don't have the choice or not about whether we want to engage in these uncomfortable conversations. Whether we like it or not, they will find us. Whereas, for people who, heterosexual, cisgender, or white people, it is possible to avoid those conversations. And I think that's a real difference in experience within academia and beyond that we have to acknowledge. So Kellen, over to you. I'd be interested to hear about your experiences in Russia and how they might relate to Christy's.
Yeah, I would have to say that Russia really kicked my butt into gear in a couple of different ways. One was, as you all know, Russian is an intensely gendered language. And so it was very odd for me when I first visited. I had been learning Russian with the female past tenses and nouns and adjectives. And I was perceived to be male on the street, and I would get caught using the wrong language and be told that I had better clean my act up or I was going to get my face punched in. And so it was one of those things where I started looking more seriously at what it meant to be perceived as a different gender. In the United States, it was more sort of fluid back and forth. Even this was the early 2000s. So it wasn't anywhere near as sort of open, maybe in some ways as it is now. But I really wasn't able to kind of go back and forth in the same way. I really felt like I was needing to pick the way that I was going to present myself and then really double down on that, because there was this real tension associated with the lack of alignment between the language that I was using and how I was presenting. And the other piece of that, in terms of kicking my butt into gear, is Russia is the place where I decided to begin a career in public health. I had been a volunteer for Special Olympics in the United States for many years and started volunteering with Special Olympics Russia and started seeing the ways in which laws, customs, norms, sort of social ideas about disability, how that affected what the experiences of people with disabilities were in Russia versus the United States. And so looking at something like the World Games for Special Olympics, there are routinely very, very high performing teams from, for example, Russia, because people who in other countries would not be institutionalized, would be living with their families and would be sort of engaging in society and having different types of opportunities. That's not the case. At least in the early 2000s, it was still very much a sort of Soviet or post-Soviet policy of people with intellectual disabilities are simply put in an institution because that is where the perception is that they can live their best, safest, most appropriate lives. And so seeing those differences in how laws, norms, customs, again, sort of organization of society, how that affected both me as a person who was sort of on this gender line, and affected people who I was working with in Special Olympics who were kind of on this disability line, this sort of, it could be viewed in different ways depending on how you turn the prism. And so I started thinking a lot more about what kind of work would allow me to engage with the types of social structures, forces, policies that dictate who has opportunity and who doesn't. And so when I left Russia in 2007, it was to go back to the United States in order to get a degree in public health, which is sort of that place that allows me, a field that allows me and others who work in the field of public health to really look at everything, because everything affects our health and our well-being, right? Everything happening outside of the doctor's office is much more important in many ways than what happens inside the doctor's office. And the last thing that I would say is that I really, on the sort of gender front, had very different experiences, both good and bad, in a way that I think, again, it saddens me to see the conversation being so flattened around, oh, well, Russia's homophobic and the former Soviet Union is so homophobic and nobody can talk about it. Nobody's doing work there. Those people don't even exist there. I mean, I certainly had a lot of drama around being identified as queer. When I was studying abroad in college, I was forced to move out of my host family's house because they decided that I was a danger to the family, that I was going to transmit HIV, which, if anyone knows anything about epidemiology, that was not going to happen. But it was simply such an association for them that if someone is queer in some way, that they must have HIV, and that then there's this clear and present danger. And so that was very hard to deal with, being there as a student and then having to leave my host family's house and figure out what to do. I ended up living with the director of the program. But then when I came back on my own, after I graduated, I came back to Moscow. That was in St. Petersburg. After I graduated, I came back to work in Moscow and was working for, as I said, Special Olympics. And I was realizing everyone was being very kind to me about what an ugly woman I was. And I appreciated what they were trying to do. And also it really brought to the forefront for me that, I needed to do something. I couldn't continue to live the way I was with this sort of lack of clarity for myself and others, and this sort of tension constantly. So I decided to figure out how to transition in Russia. I was a lab rat, if you will, for the Russian Institute of Endocrinology. There was a graduate student there who was doing research on the administration of testosterone and what it would do for transgender men, so for me. And then I went back to the United States to change my documents and didn't succeed in changing them fully. So I came back to Sheremetyevo with my old passport and old visa, and I put it down on the in front of the border guards, and they looked at it and they started laughing. And I don't know what went off in my head, but I started to talk back, and I said, I have a piece of paper. We all know, right? A piece of paper with a stamp on it, very important. So I slapped down the court order from the United States and I said, I know what this looks like, but I actually have this piece of paper that says that my name and gender have been changed. I haven't been able to do it on my passport and visa, but I'm going to do it here. And essentially, please understand that I am a real person. And they came and they called the higher up officer, who took me into a small back room. And I thought, great, this is how I get deported. But instead, he listened to me. I explained what was going on, and he listened to me, and he took my documents, and we went back to the border guards, and he explained things to them, and their entire faces just changed. Oh, we're so we didn't realize that you were a transgender person. If all you need to do is get these documents changed, because it's so clear that you need to be able to be who you are, and you should have documents that reflect that. Stamp, welcome home. And I mean, that is the kind of treatment I have never gotten in the United States, right, around something like being transgender. And so this idea that, that Russia is this monolithic country, or that this entire region is this monolithic country, that where, people can't be who they are and communities don't exist, it's just false. And so I had a lot of, as I said, scary experiences on the street in Russia. I've had scary experiences on the street in the United States. I've had really, really good experiences in Russia in talking about things like transgender issues and transgender health. So it's, you know, I think it's just really the reason I tell these stories, I suppose, is just, again, I think the importance of recognizing the diversity of people, of communities, of experiences. And that was not something that I was encouraged to do when I was studying Russia and Russian. I wasn't encouraged to think about, you know, sort of where are trans people in these different countries? Where are trans people, even in things like language? It was a total shock for all of us in my Russian language classes in college that I had to figure out how to change the language so that I could present myself appropriately in Russian-speaking contexts. And so, you know, it was a really eye-opening experience in so many ways, and really set me, as I mentioned about disability and Special Olympics, really set me on a path for doing the work that I do today, trying to look at all of these different determinants of health, these policies, social forces, et cetera, that people are exposed to in a US context, but it's equally as applicable to the study of any country.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing those experiences. So as we enter the last 5 to 10 minutes of the structured part of this conversation, something I'd like to hear all of your thoughts on is, you know, this conversation that we're having now is taking place within a US academic context, you know, and, you know, I did all of my education in Britain. I did my undergraduate there. I did my master's degree there. And when I was doing my master's degree at the School of Slavonic and East European Study at UCL, you know, there was absolutely, you know, no discussion of these issues. And I'm not saying that to single out my department. That was the case when I spoke to a lot of my friends in other, you know, Slavic and East European departments around the UK. And, you know, that it really changed for me when I moved over here to the States, and suddenly, you know, yes, the conversation was still in its very, you know, genitive phases, but it was nonetheless happening and people were talking about these issues. So I think this is particularly relevant for this group of people since, you know, Raushan and Nadja, you have experiences outside of, you know, the US academic context. So, you know, do you think it is the case that we're not seeing the same kind of push to discuss intersectionality, you know, whether that be in Europe or in Kazakhstan, in your case, Raushan, you know, do you think that's the case, or do you think those conversations are happening and they're just not getting as much airtime as the American ones maybe? So Nadja, can we go to you on that?
Sure. My experience with studying in the Balkans, there are conversations, but I do not feel that they are as intense and as often happening as they are in the US context. At the same time, now I'm studying in Vienna, and CU is an American university. There I see a difference. There is more of intersectionality being in focus. But again, I feel that there is not enough of the investments coming towards the faculty, because our faculty needs more training when it comes to intersectionality. And especially when it comes to talking about race, talking about post-colonial theory, talking about feminist theory, just so that we can avoid the danger that we mentioned, that they all just become buzzwords, then which we will then as students start repeating all the time and feeling like we've said something important. So I don't know if it's also the context. I mean, for example, when it comes to racism, anti-Roma racism, I feel that people in the Western Balkans are not very open to acknowledging it. But then when we talk about Black Lives Matter, people were very loud about it. And I was super happy to see that. But then at the same time, they could not acknowledge the anti-Roma racism. So that is something that it truly fascinates me. People understand that they should not be using the N word, that it is a racial slur. But then they use the G word. and they do not want to use the word Roma. And these double standards are something that I still don't understand. Is it a lack of investment within the universities? Also, is it the fact that we do not have, speaking strictly about the Roma community, we do not have scholars in such high positions of power who would then push for it? But also it is unfair to have only those people there who would push the whole thing for everyone else. So I honestly do not know what's the issue. Maybe it's also for the ex-Yugoslav countries that we are all living in the, so to say, in this lie that we bought while we were under socialism, that we are all equal. And maybe we still want to believe it. Even the Roma community, you know, it's sometimes we do not feel comfortable. And I'm talking also for myself. There was a part of my life that when I did not feel comfortable with acknowledging that there was microaggression going towards me due to my ethnicity. I saw it as a personal failure rather than a failure of the community and the system around me. And I don't know, there are many different things. There are conversations, but truly we need more investments going in that direction.
Absolutely. Raushan, what are your thoughts on this? You know, having spent most of your life in Kazakhstan, what are the conversations like there around these issues?
I honestly share my sentiments with Nadja. There are conversations, but usually what happens is they're not based on intersectionality, but rather one dimension of identity. Like recently, a lot of feminist movements sprung up, but they fail to also incorporate how like social class, how your ethnicity, how your like religious status matters in sort of creating your experiences. Also, like it's important to mention here that like I've been educated in like Nazarbayev University, which is sort of this government sponsored university based on like Western standards, and a lot of our professors were also like either got their degrees from the West or were Westerners. So the experience that I had there does not necessarily reflect what's going on in other universities in Kazakhstan. There, I think more and more people start questioning even like the theories that we learn in class and how those theories are applicable to what's going on in the local context. Because unfortunately, what we were learning in class was not necessarily reflective of what was happening in Central Asia, because a lot of the theories, again, were like sort of developed and in the context of Western Europe. So those are just short answer, I guess.
Great, thank you. So we're coming to the end of the section now, but before we move to the Q&A, I do have one final question, which is, so basically all of us are here in this conversation today because in one way or another, we have some degree of personal investment in the issues that we're discussing. But what I'm wondering is, you know, obviously we want our voices to be heard and we want to be able to take an active part in the conversations taking place around these issues. But the flip side of that is that very often we can experience, you know, emotional and psychological burnout because we're constantly having to do this, you know, this emotional labor, and actually often, you know, the administrative labor when it comes to organizing things like this. So to conclude this part of the session, I'd like to hear from all of you on how we can, you know, balance this issue of making sure our voices are heard while at the same time taking care of our mental health and emotional well-being. So Kellen, do you want to start on that?
This is a tough one, you know, because so much, as you've noted, is demanded of us, both professionally and personally. I will also say that it is a technique of power to keep us so busy proving the things that we already know that we don't have time to rest. We don't have time to do the work that would actually advance the boundaries of our knowledge. It is a tool of white supremacy, of patriarchy, of all of these other types of social oppressive forces to keep us chasing our tails so that we do not have time for the revolution, honestly. And how to break out of that. I mean, the whole marketing blitz of self-care, I mean, that's not it, right? We don't need bubble baths, we need real change. And how to get there requires real sustained changes at levels of these systems that so often we don't have access to. So part of it looks like allies really stepping up and recognizing that if they're in positions of power, they have a responsibility. It's not a nice thing to do. It's not a noblesse oblige, oh, we'll let the minoritized scholars have a whole room to themselves to talk to each other at the conference. That's not the change that we need. It is people in power recognizing that they have an opportunity to get out of the way after setting up circumstances, after setting things up so that the space that needs to be there, the resources that need to be there, that the supports that need to be there are actually in place. And I think so that's it's a twofold piece. One of it is allies in power who are already there, understanding their role and getting out of the often, sort of broad, that sort of white savior mentality, right? That like, it's not a nice thing to do, again, to open up space for us to do our work. It is in fact their responsibility. It is in fact essential. And the other piece of that is to provide the tangible support to younger scholars, to scholars who are coming from minoritized identity backgrounds, so that we actually are being recognized as doing the real good work, that we are not, over here looking at issues and topics that aren't important simply because an established field of scholarship that arose from white domination and colonialism, has decided aren't important. There are so many topics out there that simply are not recognized by the academy, and we are the ones doing that work, and we are the ones pushing the boundaries of the fields forward, and we need to be supported in that so that we can be the ones who are then in the positions of power to be making the decisions about what gets featured, what gets talked about, what gets supported, and how big systems like universities and academia more broadly run, so that they are running to support people, running to advance the science, not running people over.
Great, absolutely. Christy, what your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question, right? That's the big question, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's not right. I mean, it's not enough to sort of, as Kellen said, sort of just set aside these like new silos, right? Like, okay, well, people want to talk about this, so we'll just create these sections, put them all over here. They'll talk about it. That's great. We can say that we made space for people to talk about it. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's resources and it's action, right? It's not a lot of talk. So, put the money there to, do all kinds of things to fund the recruitment of students, scholars from marginalized communities, to actually do that, not to sort of just point out and say like, oh, well, we're not that diverse, we need to fix it. Why don't we have a bunch of people come and talk about how maybe we can fix it? I mean, it seems pretty clear how you could fix that. So doing that, but also other ways of providing resources, providing, as Emily, as you said, usually these kinds of silos that are carved out are also the labors taken on by folks from marginalized communities. And I mean, in a lot of institutions, not even paid. I mean, it's just, so writing that also could be helpful. I don't know. It's really hard for me because a lot of these changes just seem so commonsensical, like that it just, there's an easy way to do this if you were really invested in it. But I guess that goes back to Kellen's point. You like really need folks in position of power who are actually invested in the change and not just talking about the change, I suppose. So maybe also holding those folks accountable however we can.
100%. Nadja, let's go to you on that one.
I've recently read someone wrote a post about bell hooks and how this whole intense life in academia and knowing every day that you're in a space where you are not welcome, where people do not expect nor are happy to see you, it can really influence your quality of life. And it also made me think how there is constantly pressure to be exceptional, or almost to bring an exotic story, which will be sellable. And that's something that really takes so much energy and so much out of your focus and your amazing skills and your unique knowledge that you have, that you just do not get to use that while you constantly need to ensure that you are part of academia in the ways that the people in power want you to be. Usually in terms of like being a tokenist thing there. And that for me personally, it feeds my imposter syndrome whenever I'm viewed as a, through the lens of tokenism. Also, academia constantly insists on meritocracy and on colorblindness and all of these little practices which constantly make you feel that you will not make it, and make you question your own place there. What works for me is creating alliances with people and having uncomfortable conversations with people who are more privileged, reminding myself of my own privilege, and also making sure that I do show up. And again, like it is a lot of pressure, but if we don't collectively influence each other and support each other, I mean, it can be Christy and me, for example, and we can share it. But if you additionally have another person who is more privileged, it kind of gives you a feeling that you are more welcome. Because at the end of the day, what works for me is knowing that I'm welcome. And when you just have one person on your side, the team gets bigger and you feel more welcome and you have this capacity to create more.
Great, thank you. That's a really good point. And last but not least, Raushan, what are your thoughts on this issue of, making sure your voice is heard versus taking care of your mental health?
I agree with Nadja in a sense that we should consider ourselves as not like isolated human beings, but we are part of the network of interconnected human beings. And when we have conversations and when we have important discussions, that tends to reverberate and like spread around. And I think it's like important to acknowledge our agency in that. At the same time, I think as Kellen and as Christy mentioned, like our agency is not enough. We also need people in power, and we need allies to support us. Both in terms of tangible and intangible resources. We know that a lot of this diversity and inclusion industry sort of is built on unpaid labor of those marginalized scholars. Being in Washington, D.C., I see both academic and non-academic institutions in area studies. They sort of promise those young scholars with like exposure. But at the end of the day, the scholars and the sort of institutions benefiting them are those that are from the West. The accolades, the sort of publicity that gets attention is the Western institutions and the Western scholars, even though the unpaid labor was made by multiple research assistants, multiple interns, multiple other scholars that do the work for those institutions. So it's I think it's important here to sort of acknowledge the work that's done by them, not only being by like, oh, like good job, but also by supporting them financially. And then in terms of specifically like certain academic institutions, we need, as has been mentioned, we need systemic changes. A lot of the times when, specifically in my institution, when something happens, a lot of workshops are organized around that. And the problem is not that we don't know the things that workshops have. We heard it multiple times. We all know that like another workshop as a band-aid solution is not going to help unless you like have people empowered that want to change the system as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. Exposure does not pay the bills, as the saying goes. So that concludes the end of the structured part of today's conversation. I hope that our audience will forgive us for going over a little bit on that. But I'd like to transition now to the Q&A section of this discussion. So just as a reminder, you can use Zoom's Q&A function to submit your questions. You should see an icon for that at the bottom of your screen. So I would ask that when you do submit a question, please state your name, affiliation, and the panelist to whom your question is directed, if that's relevant. So I'll give it a couple seconds, see if anything shows up in the chat box, and then I will read out the questions and say who they are from. We don't have questions, I will definitely use my moderator's prerogative to ask a lot more that I definitely would like to pose to the panelists today. So maybe while people are thinking, I will go to this point that I think that Kellen, Nadja, and Christy, you all mentioned in kind of from slightly different angles, but the common thread was, the predominance of US specifically, but also like Western understandings of these concepts of race and intersectionality. We obviously have to be very careful about not just seeing like racial dynamics or interethnic dynamics in, the Balkans or in Russia as through the lens of how we understand those issues in America. But on the other hand, I think that there's also this danger that we run into of, I've encountered a lot of people who say, well, we simply can't talk about race or LGBTQ plus issues in this field because they do not exist in these countries. I very recently, I'm not going to name and shame, but I did have a conversation with someone in DC who said that, race is an American concept, and therefore if we talk about it when we're talking about the former Soviet Union, that means we're imposing American ideology onto these countries, that was the whole thing. But it definitely gave me a lot of food for thought. And I think this is kind of the ideal group to address this issue in. So I'd be interested to hear, your thoughts on, obviously we want to avoid US-centric discussions, and we want to avoid, just imposing US terminology onto these topics. But at the same time, we don't want that to become an excuse for not talking about these issues within this field. So while waiting for people to submit their questions, Christy, I liked your facial expressions while I was telling that story. So why don't you jump in on that?
Oh no, it's just so frustrating because I feel like the people who would say that are the same people who don't. They'll say race is an American concept, but it's simultaneously one they don't talk about even in America. Like it's one they don't want to address even here. So that's just such a backhanded way to sort of just maintain status quo. I mean, like just it's a hard line to walk sometimes because like you say, and like others know, like obviously you don't want to just impose your own definitions or understandings onto other areas, obviously, but to say that things like racialization, minoritization, these kinds of things are just like exclusive to one country it's just mind-boggling in my opinion. I mean, you could say racialization doesn't look like in Russia, for example, what it might look like in the United States. Like, of course, I mean, these are different places, but it seems like, I don't know, to me it just seems like those things, the fact that the human mind is, we like to categorize, it's a blessing and a curse. That's a human thing. It's a universal thing. Oppression is a human thing. Unfortunately, it's a universal thing. Marginalization, like you can't, like, to just take one of those forms of marginalization and to just claim with, I'm assuming no research into the matter, that this doesn't exist there because I guess you don't want to talk about it there, is entirely negligent. Gross negligence, in fact. Yeah. So I don't know. Yeah, I'm kind of baffled when I hear stories like that, honestly. I don't know.
So I think we'll come back to this, but we've had a good question from one of the audience members in the chat. So this question is from Brendan Herbert, who is a master's student at Paris-Nanterre University. This is a question that he says is addressed to all the panelists. And he says, when doing interviews in the New East context for a Western viewership, what are the appropriate ways to credit local sources and make sure that they get the acknowledgement for their shared part in crafting the findings? So why don't we start with Raushan on that, since that's something that you were mentioning in your comments earlier?
Well, I think the important part is just to cite them in the first place and to sort of acknowledge the work that has been done before. I personally haven't done any interviews in Kazakhstan for my academic work, but I've done a bunch of interviews for some journalistic work. And there, especially in autocratic context, you sort of, I think, need to, especially if it's a sensitive topic, you need to be sort of walk this, fine line between trying to protect your informants, but at the same time also giving them credit. And it's something that you should probably ask your sources if they're even comfortable to being cited.
Mm-hmm. Nadja, do you have any thoughts on this, particularly from the perspective of someone in the Roma community?
I've been doing field work in the Roma communities across Balkans, and people there are, especially in one Kosovo Roma refugee camp in Montenegro, they would tell me how tired they are of people coming there, extracting things, and then just leaving them behind to deal with. Because just the moment when you give an interview, you are recalling all of the moments how you were racialized in the context of war, and someone just leaves you after that, and you have to deal with that. So first ask if it is a citation that helps them. In some contexts, it can be a piece for the local newspaper, and then you can, through that, give them more agency, because the local authorities might see this as a more serious issue. Other things that I've done and I think could be useful are, for example, offering English language lessons to the kids in the community that I worked with. I'll work with the local NGOs and ask them if there is a way that you could, for example, finance, if it's, for example, war refugees, if you can finance psychological support. But ask people. I mean, it is very simple. I know that it can be uncomfortable, and academia might make us feel that we should just take the credit for ourselves, but it is another human being. It is not about extracting, it's about creating together.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So we have another interesting question in the chat from Amaryllis Luga de Favorites from Howard University here in DC. Her question is, how can we help people in the older generations to understand the importance of intersectionality? She says that some of her older peers have quite a hard time wrapping their heads around this concept. Who wants to jump in on that? Kellen, do you have anything to say about how we can help people from different age groups understand this issue?
Again, a tough question. There's been a lot of tough questions today. I think each of us has different levels of comfort with our own stories and different levels of support, sort of logistical support in our careers, or, support for our own mental health and well-being. But for those of us who do have the privileges to be able to speak openly about who we are and what our experiences have been, for those of us who enjoy some of the privileges, for example, of looking like me, I consider it, I'm not speaking for anyone else, but for myself, I consider it my responsibility to engage directly with older peers and with other white people and with other men to say, you know, this is what this means. This is what what it has looked like in my life. And if you can break, you know, have a little bit of your mind to kind of go that way and walk with me as a fellow white person or a fellow man or whatever you need to hold on to in my identity, then that is something that I consider it, again, for me specifically. I would never say that it is incumbent upon any of us to do this, but it is a recognition of my own privilege and the need to use that to try to present some of these truths of what it is like to do this work, to be from groups that are marginalized, minoritized, often dismissed in scholarship. Because so much of the work, as has been said earlier, so much of the work falls on people who are very visibly minoritized in the field, and that is the kind of extra unpaid labor that is emotionally taxing, that is often it impacts people's careers. And so I think it's very important for anyone who is listening to this and thinking, well, I'm just a nice white dude, what can I do? Like, you can have conversations with other white dudes. You can have conversations with other white people. You can learn from people of color who have written about this. Don't go and ask your friends of color, you know, what do I do about XYZ? It's all on the internet. People have already written up all the things that we need to know about what intersectionality looks like for different groups of people, for different individuals, the ways that it hurts people, the ways that it shows up and stifles our scholarship. So go do the work of self-education. Again, and I'm saying this to someone like me, right, who has this sort of, you know, these unmarked identities, this ability to move through the world and move through academic discourse without having aspects of my identity marked, because man is just assumed to be the default. White is just assumed to be the default. If you have those default identities, do the work to try to help other folks who share those identities understand what it is like to be marked, understand the ways in which these different aspects of our identity can privilege us in so many ways, and what it means then to take those glasses off, right? To see the water that we're swimming in as fish who have never, you know, in so many ways, I never had any cause to question who I was or what advantages I had because I lived in a highly segregated area of the United States. It didn't occur to me until I got out of the United States to realize what not only the history, but the current practice of the United States is around racism. And so to try to look for, again, opportunities to educate myself and then to speak to other people who look like me, because that is the kind of emotional labor that it is incumbent, again, speaking personally, upon me to do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, thank you. So I think in the interest of time, like we unfortunately only have about 3 minutes left, we'll go to the final question, which I think is relevant to all the panelists here. So this question is from Stephen Siegel from University of Texas, Austin. So his question is about providing structural material and tangible support for minoritized academics in the field. So his question is, could the panelists perhaps say a few words about their visions for improving the contingency/precarity situation in this field? Is that more postdocs, more mentoring, more scholarships, fellowships from professional organizations? And he says that this is definitely a big topic for this coming year. So why don't we go around the virtual room, and if I can ask you to try and keep your answers short in the interest of time. Let's start with Raushan, and then we'll go to Nadja.
Well, definitely a part of it has to be more scholarships and fellowship, but that's definitely not enough. Already scholars have been doing a lot of work on that front and have been producing consistently. The problem is that the current work that they're doing is severely underpaid. You know, as a graduate student in the US, I can tell you that a lot of us have not even like a minimum wage, but also when it comes to health insurance, it's really hard. You cannot afford to get sick here. So just paying, I guess, well, is
Nadja, over to you.
Just a short intervention about including older peers. Please do not shame people. It does not work. And I've seen that a lot coming from younger scholars. It does not work. Set boundaries, but do not shame. I think that CU, where I'm studying currently, is doing a magnificent job. We have different programs, and I think that there is money going around, but the exchange of good practices is not happening. For example, CU has a specific program for Roma students, 1 year of investing in helping you craft your skills, but also gain more self-confidence. And also they open different opportunities for us. For example, in 2 months from now, I should be at Cambridge for a week doing a research study. And that's a wise way of using money, because you're making us come into the rooms where usually you do not meet people from communities like mine. So open doors, invest money wisely.
Absolutely. Christy, what's your thoughts on the resources question?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Raushan and Nadja said. Funding, opening doors, totally crucial. I'll speak to the mentoring part, which I think is also super crucial. The investment of time, time and support, emotional, professional support. A lot of times marginalized scholars, researchers from marginalized positions don't have, the same experience or roadmap or models in their social networks to know what's expected of them in a lot of these institutions. And that even just like that's emotional support to let the scholars know, oh, no, you're welcome here, you're supported, your research is valuable, can like really change your entire outlook on the work you're doing, just to feel like people are supporting you. You don't want to leave those scholars alone in those institutions. So yeah.
Absolutely. And last but not least, Kellen, what are your thoughts on this question?
I mean, I would just echo what everyone else has said. I think there have been so many incredible ideas that have already been shared. And so listening to folks who are not the white man is, I think, the best way to end this conversation today.
Great. Thanks so much. So looking at the clock, that is unfortunately all that we'll have time for today. So I'd like to once again thank University of Pittsburgh Center for Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies for hosting this important conversation, as well as our 4 amazing panelists today for their really insightful and interesting comments. And thanks so much for listeners and viewers for joining us. I really hope this session is just the beginning of a much broader conversation. So just before we end, a reminder that this is an ongoing series, and to tune in to the next panel in the discussion. So that's it from us. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. Have a good day and enjoy the rest of your evenings. Bye.